March 3, 1943. The Pacific Ocean. An American bomber is racing toward a Japanese warship at 200 miles per hour. But here's what's strange. This bomber isn't flying high in the sky where it's supposed to be safe. It's flying so low that its propellers are almost touching the ocean waves, just 50 feet above the water. Inside the cockpit, the pilot can see Japanese sailors on the ship's deck scrambling to their guns. They're pointing their weapons right at him. Any second now, they're going to start shooting. The pilot's name is Major Edward Larner. His hands are steady on the controls. His thumb rests on a trigger button. 3 months ago, military engineers told him this airplane would fall apart if he ever pressed that button. They said the guns bolted onto the nose would literally rip the plane to pieces in midair. They called it a suicide box. They said it was impossible. But Larner knows something those engineers don't know. This plane was built by a man who doesn't care about impossible. A 43-year-old former Navy pilot named Pappy. A father whose wife and 4 kids are trapped in a Japanese prison camp, slowly starving to death. Gunn took a normal bomber, a plane designed to drop bombs from way up high, and turned it into something completely different. He packed 8 heavy machine guns into the nose. Guns that fire 80 bullets per second. Guns that can cut through steel like a chainsaw through wood. The engineers laughed at him. They said it couldn't work. Larner is about to prove them wrong. He presses the trigger. The nose of his bomber explodes with fire. 8 machine guns roar to life all at once. The entire plane shakes violently. The noise is deafening. But the plane doesn't fall apart. Instead, something else happens. Down on the water, the Japanese warship starts getting torn to shreds. This is the true story of how one angry father broke every rule, ignored every expert, and built an illegal weapon that changed the entire Pacific War. The story of how Junkyard scraps became the most feared bomber in World War II. The story of Pappy Gunn and the B-25 Strafer. Let me be clear about something from the start. Paul Gunn wasn't a hero because he wanted glory. He was a hero because his wife and 4 kids were locked in a Japanese prison camp, slowly starving to death, and he'd figured out that the fastest way to get them back was to personally destroy every ship bringing supplies to the Philippines. That's not patriotism. That's not duty. That's a father with a welding torch and unlimited access to wrecked airplanes who decided that if the Army Air Forces wouldn't give him the weapon he needed, he'd build it himself. Here's what makes Gunn's story different from every other World War II aviation tale. He wasn't a decorated test pilot with an engineering degree from MIT. He was a 43-year-old enlisted Navy veteran who'd retired to fly commercial cargo planes in Manila. He learned his craft by doing, not by studying. When the war started and his family got trapped, Gunn didn't request a transfer to a combat unit. He walked into a hangar full of wrecked P-40 fighters, started stripping .50 caliber machine guns off the broken airframes, and began bolting them onto anything that would fly. The brass told him to stop. He ignored them. The engineers told him it was impossible. He proved them wrong. The factory told him they'd build what he designed. He went to California and showed them how. By the time Paul Gunn was finished, he'd revolutionized aerial warfare in the Pacific, turned the B-25 Mitchell into the most feared anti-shipping weapon of World War II, and personally contributed to sinking over 100 Japanese vessels. But none of that mattered to him as much as February 3, 1945, the day American cavalry smashed through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp and found his wife Polly and their 4 children still alive. This is the story of how one man's rage became innovation, how junkyard parts became weapons of war, and how the impossible modification that engineers mocked ended up being adopted as standard equipment by the very factory that said it couldn't work. Welcome to the story of Pappy Gunn and the B-25 Strafer. Here's a math problem the U.S. Army Air Forces couldn't solve in 1942. How do you hit a moving target that can see your weapon coming for 40 seconds and just move? The American war planners had built their entire bombing strategy around one piece of technology, the Norden bomb sight. This was supposed to be the miracle device that would let B-17 flying fortresses rain precision death from 20,000 feet. The propaganda films showed bombs dropping neatly into factory chimneys. The generals told Congress about pickle barrel accuracy. It was complete fantasy. Here's what actually happened when you tried to bomb a ship from 20,000 feet. Your bombardier looks through his fancy Norden sight, calculates wind speed, adjusts for target motion, accounts for air density, and releases the bomb. That bomb then falls for approximately 40 seconds, nearly 3/4 of a minute, before it hits the water. During those 40 seconds, the Japanese ship captain sees the bomber overhead, orders a course change, watches the bomb falling, steers his ship away from the impact point, possibly has time to light a cigarette while he watches the explosion in his wake. The hit rate for high-altitude bombing against moving ships in 1942? Less than 1%. One bomb out of every 100 actually struck something other than ocean. The American taxpayer was funding the world's most expensive fishing expedition. Meanwhile, the Japanese were running circles around the Allies in the Southwest Pacific. Their Tokyo Express, fast destroyer convoys carrying troops and supplies, was landing thousands of soldiers every week in New Guinea, Rabaul, and the Solomon Islands. Each convoy that made it through meant more Japanese fortifications, more airstrips, more threats to Australia. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, looked at his combat reports and realized he had a fundamental problem. The weapons he'd been given couldn't do the job he needed done. His B-17s were magnificent aircraft, but they were the wrong tool for this fight. He needed something that could hunt ships the way a wolf hunts deer, low, fast, and close enough to guarantee a kill. That weapon didn't exist. But in a hangar in Brisbane, Australia, an angry 43-year-old former Navy pilot was about to invent it. Paul Irvin Gunn was born October 18, 1899, in Quitman, Arkansas, about as far from the Pacific Ocean as you can get in America. He joined the U.S. Navy before World War I ended, became an enlisted aviation pilot, not an officer, important distinction, and spent 2 decades flying for Uncle Sam. He served with VF-1B Top Hatters, one of the Navy's oldest fighter squadrons. He was a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Pensacola. By 1939, after 21 years of service, Chief Petty Officer Paul Gunn had had enough of military life. He retired, married a woman named Polly, some sources say her name was Clara Louise, nicknamed Polly, and moved to Manila with their 4 children, Nathaniel, Paul Jr., Connie, and Julie. Gunn took a job flying for Philippine Airlines, delivering mail, transporting cargo and passengers between the islands. It was simple, peaceful work. He loved the Philippines. The weather was good. The flying was easy. His kids went to decent schools. For 2 years, life was perfect. Then December 7, 1941, changed everything. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. 8 hours later, they bombed the Philippines. Most of the American B-17s at Clark Field were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. Gunn was flying a routine mail run when he heard the news on his radio. By the time he landed, the U.S. Army Air Forces had already commissioned him as a captain. They needed every pilot they could find, and Gunn had 20-plus years of experience. Within weeks, American and Filipino forces were being pushed back to Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese were coming fast, and they weren't taking prisoners. Here's where Gunn made the decision that would define the rest of his life. In February 1942, with Bataan under siege and running out of supplies, Gunn volunteered to fly an unarmed civilian plane through Japanese-controlled airspace to deliver medicine to the trapped soldiers. He did it successfully, threading through enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire to bring desperately needed supplies. For this mission, he'd later receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. But Gunn's personal hell was just beginning. In April 1942, Gunn was ordered to participate in the Royce mission, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to bring reinforcements to the Philippines using a handful of B-25 bombers. The mission failed. Bataan fell. Then Corregidor fell. The Philippines were lost. Gunn begged to go back for his family. According to some accounts, General Douglas MacArthur had promised Gunn he could evacuate his wife and children, then forbade it when the tactical situation collapsed. Whether that story is true or not, one thing is certain: Paul Gunn blamed MacArthur almost as much as he blamed the Japanese. Polly Gunn and their 4 children were captured on January 2, 1942, and imprisoned at Santo Tomas internment camp, a converted university in Manila where the Japanese held approximately 4,000 American and Allied civilians. Gunn knew what happened in Japanese prison camps. The starvation rations. The disease. The casual cruelty. Every day that passed was another day his children might not survive. So Paul Gunn stopped being a pilot and became something else entirely. An engineer. A weapons designer. A man with nothing to lose and unlimited motivation to turn every airplane in the Pacific into a ship-killing machine. When General George Kenney arrived in Australia to take command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific in July 1942, he inherited a disaster. His bombers couldn't hit ships. His fighters lacked range. His supply situation was chaos. The Japanese were winning, and they weren't even slowing down. Then Kenney met Paul Gunn. Gunn was in a hangar at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, surrounded by wrecked aircraft, P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras that had been destroyed during training accidents or crashed during ferry flights. Most people saw junk. Gunn saw spare parts. He was in the process of stripping .50 caliber machine guns off the wrecked fighters. He had an idea that he'd been pitching to anyone who would listen. Take the Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber, rip out the bombardier station in the nose, and pack it full of forward-firing machine guns. The A-20 had 4.30 caliber guns in the nose, useful for strafing, but not powerful enough to suppress anti-aircraft fire from ships. Gunn wanted to replace them with 4.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, the same weapons used on fighters, but firing forward from a bomber. Most officers would have told him to get back to work and stop wasting time on crazy ideas. General Kenney said, "Show me." Gunn worked with Captain Frederick G. Hoffman, an Army Air Force engineer, to design the modification. They cut into the A-20's nose, mounted the 4 heavy machine guns, ran ammunition feeds through the bombardier station, and reinforced the structure to handle the recoil. The first test flight was successful. Kenney was impressed. More than impressed, he was excited. This was the weapon he needed. But Gunn wasn't satisfied with the A-20. It had limited range and couldn't carry enough bombs. He wanted to do the same thing to the B-25 Mitchell, a much larger, more capable medium bomber. In November 1942, General Kenney told Gunn, "I want 12 forward-firing guns on every B-25 we have." Gunn got to work. The first B-25 he modified was serial number 41 to 12,437. This became Pappy's Folly, a name that perfectly captured what everyone thought about the project. Here's what Gunn did. Ripped out the bombardier station. At low altitude, the pilot would release the bombs himself. No need for a guy with a bomb sight. Installed 4.50 caliber machine guns in the nose. These were the main weapons, firing directly forward. Added 4 more .50s in cheek packs. Streamlined gun pods mounted on each side of the fuselage below the cockpit windows, adding 2 guns per side. Kept the top turret. The dorsal turret had 2 more .50 calibers that could be swiveled forward to add to the firepower. Total, 10 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, 8 fixed, 2 from the turret if needed. The engineers at North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, heard about this and sent telegrams saying it was impossible. The weight of the guns and 500 rounds of ammunition per gun would shift the center of gravity so far forward that the plane would be nose-heavy and difficult to control. The recoil from firing 8 guns simultaneously would cause structural failure. The muzzle blast from the cheek guns would buckle the thin aluminum fuselage skin. Gunn's response, according to legend, was, "Tell them to put the center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." He test flew the first B-25 Strafer himself. It flew. It flew well. And when he pressed the firing button, all 8 nose guns roared to life, the plane shuddered but held together, and a concentrated stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds converged at 1,000 yards into a cone of destruction that could shred steel. Gunn had built a flying buzzsaw. Having guns on your bomber is one thing. Knowing how to use them is another. Gunn understood that his Strafer modification solved half the problem. It gave the bomber offensive firepower to suppress enemy anti-aircraft guns. But you still needed to sink the ship. That's where skip bombing came in. Skip bombing wasn't Gunn's invention. Credit for that goes to Major William G. Benn and the B-17 crews of the 43rd Bomb Group, who developed the technique in late 1942. But Gunn perfected it and made it the standard tactic for his modified B-25s. Here's how it worked. The bomber comes in at wave-top height, literally 50 to 250 feet off the water, flying at about 200 miles per hour. The pilot aims directly at the target ship, heading straight for its broadside. At about 300 to 500 yards out, while still firing the nose guns to suppress enemy gunners, the pilot releases a 500-pound bomb. But here's the crucial part: the bomb doesn't fall. It flies forward at the same speed as the aircraft, 200 miles per hour. When the bomb hits the water at that shallow angle and high speed, it doesn't sink. It skips, like a flat stone thrown across a pond. Bounce, bounce, bounce. Then it slams into the side of the ship right at the waterline. The bomb has a 4 to 5 second delay fuse, which gives the attacking aircraft time to roar over the ship's mast and escape before the explosion. The bomb penetrates below the waterline and detonates inside the ship's hull, blowing a massive hole that floods the engine room. The technique was devastatingly effective because no lead calculation needed. The pilot just aims at the ship and releases when close enough. Minimal time for evasion. Unlike high-altitude bombing where the ship has 40 seconds to turn, skip bombing gives them maybe 5 seconds. Waterline hits, high-altitude bombs that hit ships usually struck the deck and caused relatively minor damage. Skip bombs hit at the waterline where a hole means immediate flooding. The drawback? You had to fly straight toward a warship bristling with anti-aircraft guns, at an altitude where every weapon on that ship could hit you. That's where Gunn's gun modification became essential. As the B-25 approached at wave-top height, the pilot opened fire with the 8 nose guns 2,000 yards out, well before the ship could effectively target him. That concentrated firepower would rake the deck, kill the anti-aircraft crews, destroy the bridge windows, and force everyone to take cover. By the time the bomber was close enough to release its skip bomb, the ship's defensive fire had been silenced. It was brutal. It was effective. And it was about to win a battle that would change the entire Pacific War. Early March 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. Japanese military planners were feeling confident. They'd assembled a massive convoy, 8 cargo ships, transports, carrying nearly 7,000 troops, escorted by 8 destroyers. Destination: La, New Guinea. If those troops landed, they'd reinforce Japanese positions enough to threaten Allied control of the entire region. The Japanese commanders knew the Americans would try to stop them. But they also knew American high-altitude bombing was laughably ineffective against ships. And then there was the weather. A tropical storm system had moved into the Bismarck Sea, creating heavy clouds and rain. Perfect conditions to hide a convoy. The B-17s would be blind. They couldn't bomb what they couldn't see through the clouds. On March 1st, the convoy departed Rabaul, confident they'd reach La without losing a single ship. They were catastrophically wrong. Because what the Japanese didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the Americans had stopped trying to bomb from 20,000 feet. They were coming in at 50 feet. The morning of March 3, 1943, started with clouds breaking over the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese convoy was in tight defensive formation, destroyers in a protective ring around the cargo ships. Lookouts were scanning the sky for high-altitude bombers. At 10 a.m., they spotted aircraft. But these planes weren't at 20,000 feet. They were skimming the wave tops. Leading the attack were RAF Beaufighters, heavy Australian twin-engine fighters that came in first to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Behind them came Gunn's B-25 strafers from the 3rd Bombardment Group's 90th Squadron. 12 modified B-25s, each carrying 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns and 500-pound skip bombs. Major Edward Larner led the first wave. His target was the Japanese transport Kayakasi Maru, a large cargo ship packed with troops and supplies. Larner's B-25 came in from the side, so low that his propellers were leaving a wake in the water. At 2,000 yards, he opened fire. 8 machine guns erupted simultaneously. The combined rate of fire was 4,800 rounds per minute, 80 bullets every second converging on the target. The effect was like hitting the ship with a circular saw made of lead. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the thin steel deck plating. They shredded the anti-aircraft gun mounts. They turned the bridge into a kill zone. The Japanese gunners tried to return fire, but they couldn't. The suppressive fire was too intense. Men were dying before they could aim their weapons. At 300 yards, Larner released his 500-pound bomb. The bomb hit the water, skipped twice, and slammed into the Kyokusei Maru's hull at the waterline with the force of a freight train. 5 seconds later, the explosion blew a hole the size of a garage door in the ship's side. The engine room flooded instantly. The ship began listing immediately. Larner pulled up, barely clearing the ship's mast as it started to sink. Behind him, 11 more B-25 strafers were making their runs. What happened next was less a battle than an execution. The Japanese formation disintegrated. The destroyers tried to maneuver, but they couldn't escape aircraft flying at 200 knots. The B-25s circled like sharks, picking their targets, making their runs. Captain Bill Thompson's bomber attacked the destroyer Horatio. The 8 nose guns shredded the destroyer's deck and bridge. His skip bomb hit below the waterline. The destroyer broke in half and sank in less than 5 minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Clinton True's aircraft targeted the cargo ship Tio Maru. The ship was carrying 150mm artillery pieces and ammunition. When True's skip bomb detonated inside the hold, the entire ship exploded in a fireball that rose 1,000 feet into the air. The B-25 flying behind True had to fly through the flames. The paint on its wings blistered from the heat. One after another, the Japanese ships died. The accuracy was staggering. In high-altitude bombing, a 10% hit rate was considered excellent. The B-25 strafers were achieving nearly 50%. One bomb in 2 was striking its target. By the time the initial wave of 12 B-25s had exhausted their bombs, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. But Gunn's pilots weren't done. They'd run out of bombs, but they still had ammunition for the machine guns. They came back for strafing runs. They attacked the crippled ships, shredding lifeboats, strafing survivors in the water, finishing off vessels that were trying to limp away. It was brutal. It was merciless. But the pilots remembered stories of Japanese atrocities against prisoners. They remembered that their own families might be in camps like Santo Tomas. They kept shooting until their gun barrels glowed red and the ammunition belts ran dry. When the Battle of the Bismarck Sea ended 3 days later, the numbers told a story that military historians still find hard to believe. Japanese losses. All 8 cargo transports, sunk 4 destroyers, sunk 1 light cruiser, heavily damaged, later sunk approximately 3,664 Japanese soldiers and sailors, killed 0 troops successfully landed at La. American losses. 13 airmen killed, 5 aircraft lost. It was one of the most lopsided victories in naval warfare history. And it was won primarily by Pappy guns, impossible modification. The high-altitude B-17s that also participated in the battle claimed some hits, but post-battle analysis of the wrecks told the real story. The ships had holes at the waterline. That was the signature of skip bombing. The decks were shredded, the bridges destroyed. That was the signature of the strafer nose guns. The Japanese sent a message back to Tokyo that read, "The enemy has developed a new type of low-altitude bombing. It is extremely accurate and cannot be evaded." They had no idea it had been developed by a 43-year-old former Navy chief with a welding torch and a personal grudge. Remember those engineers at North American Aviation who said Gunn's modifications were impossible? Remember Wright Field sending telegrams demanding the aircraft be grounded? In late March 1943, General Kenny was in Washington, D.C. for a high-level strategy conference. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the entire U.S. Army Air Forces, called Kenny into his office. Waiting inside were a group of test engineers from North American Aviation. They proceeded to explain to Kenny, in great technical detail, why his B-25 strafer proposal was unworkable. The center of gravity was too far forward. The structural loads would cause fatigue failures. The modification was dangerous and should not be approved for production. Kenny let them finish. Then he smiled and said, "Gentlemen, I hate to tell you this, but we already have an entire squadron of strafers in combat. They just sank 12 Japanese ships in one day." The engineers' jaws hit the floor. Kenny continued, And we have 60 more B-25s in line for modification at the depot in Townsville. So maybe you should go back to California and figure out how to build what we've already proven works. The engineering team, thoroughly embarrassed, agreed to return to the factory and incorporate Gunn's modifications into the production line. Kenny sent Gunn himself to California to show them how. By late 1943, North American Aviation was producing the B-25J with a factory-installed solid nose packed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, using a refined version of Gunn's design. The suicide box, that couldn't possibly fly, became standard equipment for the rest of the war. Pappy Gunn never got a patent. He never received royalties. He just got the satisfaction of seeing his design vindicated and mass-produced. And he got to keep killing Japanese ships. If 8.50 caliber machine guns were good, Gunn decided a cannon would be better. In mid-1943, Gunn took a 75mm field artillery piece, a weapon designed to be towed behind a truck and fired from the ground, and figured out how to mount it in the nose of a B-25. Let me be clear about what this means. He put a cannon that could destroy a tank into an airplane. The M475mm cannon was 9.5 feet long and weighed 900 pounds without ammunition. Each shell weighed 15 pounds. When you fired it from an airplane, the recoil was so violent that it would momentarily stop the aircraft in midair. You'd lose 20 to 30 knots of airspeed in an instant. The first test firing reportedly popped rivets throughout the fuselage, filled the cockpit with smoke and cordite fumes, and nearly knocked the pilot unconscious from the concussion. Gunn's solution was to mount the cannon on a recoil rail that extended under the pilot's seat, allowing the gun to slide backward 21 inches every time it fired. It was insane. It worked. The B-25G and B-25H models were produced with the 75mm cannon as standard equipment. In theory, you could sink a destroyer with a single shell. In practice, the cannon was difficult to use. The navigator had to manually load each round into the breech behind the pilot's seat. The weapon could only fire about 4 to 5 rounds per mission before the structural stress became concerning. And by 1944, there weren't enough Japanese ships left to justify the complexity. Most B-25H units ended up removing the 75mm cannon and installing 8.50 caliber machine guns instead, going back to Gunn's original design. But for a brief period, American medium bombers carried artillery pieces into battle, and it was all because one angry father wouldn't accept impossible as an answer. Pappy Gunn flew combat missions throughout 1943 and 1944. He wasn't supposed to, as a field modification specialist and by late in the war a lieutenant colonel, he had a desk job. But Gunn didn't care about regulations. He flew with the squadrons he'd armed, testing his own modifications in combat. In October 1944, during the liberation of the Philippines, Gunn was flying a mission over Tacloban airfield on Leyte when his aircraft was hit by a white phosphorus bomb. White phosphorus is one of the worst substances you can encounter in war. It burns at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, can't be extinguished with water, and continues burning as long as it has oxygen. Gunn's arm was badly burned. He lost a finger. He should have been evacuated to a hospital ship and sent home. Instead, he convinced the flight surgeons to let him keep flying. He argued, cajoled, and possibly threatened. Whatever he said worked. He was back in the cockpit within weeks. Because Paul Gunn had one goal that superseded everything else. He would not leave the Pacific until his family was free. By early 1945, American forces were closing in on Manila. General MacArthur's promise to return was finally being fulfilled. On February 3, 1945, the 1st Cavalry Division smashed through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp. They found 3,700 civilians, skeletal, starving, barely alive. The internees had been surviving on less than 700 calories per day. Among them were Polly Gunn and her 4 children, Nathaniel, Paul Jr., Connie, and Julie. They had endured 3 years of hell. They'd survived starvation, disease, and brutality. When Paul Gunn walked through those gates, he wasn't Pappy, the legendary field engineer who'd revolutionized aerial warfare. He was just a husband and father who'd spent every waking moment of the last 3 years building machines violent enough to save them. He found them alive. Everything else, the medals, the innovations, the ships at the bottom of the Pacific, all of it was secondary to that moment. After the war, the Air Force wanted to keep Gunn. They offered promotions, a comfortable desk job at the Pentagon, opportunities to train the next generation of engineers. Gunn turned them all down. He'd spent 4 years fighting. He was done with uniforms and regulations. He stayed in the Philippines, the place he'd always loved. He started a civilian airline, Philippine Air Services, and went back to flying cargo and passengers between the islands. Simple work. Peaceful work. But men like Pappy Gunn don't die in retirement homes. On October 11, 1957, Gunn was piloting a Beechcraft Bonanza through a thunderstorm near Manila. He was 57 years old. He'd survived the Japanese Navy, jungle warfare, plane crashes, and phosphorus burns. But he couldn't survive the weather. The Bonanza went down in the mountains. Paul Gunn died on impact. His wife Polly and their children survived him. They lived long, full lives, the lives their father had fought so hard to give them. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, you'll find a B-25J Mitchell with a solid nose packed with 8.50 caliber machine guns. The placard explains that this was the strafer configuration designed for low-level anti-shipping attacks in the Pacific. What it doesn't say is that the entire design came from one angry father with a welding torch who refused to accept that his family was going to die in a prison camp. Paul Gunn's influence didn't end with World War II. When you look at the A-10 Warthog, essentially a massive 30mm cannon with wings wrapped around it, you're looking at Gunn's philosophy made modern. When you see an AC-130 gunship circling a target, pouring fire from the sky, that's the evolution of Gunn's strafer concept. The idea that an aircraft can be both the bomb and the bomber, that suppressive fire and precision delivery can be combined into one platform, that a medium bomber can be transformed into a gunship, all of that traces back to a hangar in Brisbane in 1942. But here's what really matters about Pappy Gunn's story. He proved that innovation doesn't require advanced degrees or billion-dollar laboratories. Sometimes it just requires desperation, determination, and a willingness to ignore everyone who tells you something is impossible. The engineers said the center of gravity made the strafer unflyable. Gunn told them to shut up and watch it fly. The factory said the recoil would tear the nose off. Gunn bolted it together with salvaged springs and proved them wrong. The manual said medium bombers attack from 8,000 feet. Gunn said the manual was written by people who'd never had to sink a ship, and he flew at 50 feet instead. And when the Tokyo Express thought they could reinforce their garrisons under cover of clouds, Gunn's impossible modifications sank 12 ships in 15 minutes and changed the entire course of the Pacific War. Every B-25 strafer that flew after March 1943, every ship sunk, every Japanese convoy destroyed, every Allied life saved, all of it happened because one man loved his family enough to break every rule in the book. That's the real story of Pappy Gunn. Not the medals. Not the kill count. Not even the revolutionary aircraft design. The real story is that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war isn't the one that follows all the regulations. It's the one built by someone who's willing to ignore every regulation to protect the people they love.